Well, those are the top stories. Now, news coming in today is that a suspect has been arrested for the brutal murder of 19-year-old Precious Ramabulana in Limpopo province. Trade Union Federation FEDUSA believes perpetrators like these should be tried under a Femicide Act. You'll recall President Cyril Ramaphosa promising legislation to deal with the scourge last year. But just how easy is it to enact a new piece of legislation? To discuss this, we're joined in the studio by Germanos from the Helen Suzman Foundation. Leanne, good morning. Thank you very much for your time. In fact, even beyond last year, the president recently, when women took to the streets of our country, in the length and breadth of our country recently, after the killing of Uyine Mkhwejana in Cape Town, they were calling for urgent measures. He promised there'll be new legislation, there'll be a harsher sentencing, but it looks like it's taking long. We don't even have a Femicide Act, you were telling me just before we went on air.
No, we don't even have a femicide bill. To be honest, that's one of the measures that we can try and implement is new legislation. That'll only deal with one side of trying to deal with femicide and gender-based violence, which is the punishment side. Cyril Ramaphosa has said it before in the summit on, I think it was gender-based violence and femicide last year, that we have very progressive laws, and we do. But we just have a problem with implementing them.
Before we're talking about the other laws that we have and what's going on with its implementation, Femicide Act, for you to have one, you're going to need a bill.
That's right.
Do we need to spend energy in drafting a new bill when we have a raft of legislation already that we could use to make sure that perpetrators of rape, murder, femicide are punished?
I personally don't think we need a whole new bill. We already have a very extensive, it's called the Criminal Law Amendment Act, and a particular amendment was on sexual offences and related matters. That's when legislation was amended in 2007 to basically accommodate all the different types of rapes, to update our sexual offences legislation. So a whole new act wouldn't be quite necessary. If anything, an amendment or a further amendment to this act would be needed to include the specific crime of femicide.
Yeah, because, I mean, while Trade Union Federation FEDUSA believes a new act like a Femicide Act might be necessary and their intentions might be understandable and good, in fact, we should be asking government to look into those kind of laws that exist already and how to amend them and tighten them and make those provisions harsher in terms of punishment.
Absolutely. I mean, we already have murder is a crime. Murder is a crime that also then engenders a life sentence. Femicide is the murder specifically of woman or a perceived female on the basis of her gender identity. So all it is a slight amendment of the definition of murder to include the gender identity element.
Is it possible? I'm not a lawyer. Is it possible to be able to look at the laws that talk about murder, that deal with murder, and tweak and to include a specific provision around femicide?
We could do that, but it would still also bring about the same type of punishment. It is still murder. Femicide is still murder. It's the murder of a person, but in particular a female, which would bring about a life sentence. So I don't know I don't quite know what the need would be to tweak.
Okay, but in answering the first question, you said we do have existing legislation, and the president himself has said, yes, we have comprehensive laws in this country to deal with this kind of thing. Where are we failing our women?
We're failing it, unfortunately, with the implementation. We're failing it we're failing as a society. Who is committing all these heinous crimes. We're failing in the criminal justice system, the police, prosecutors, the judiciary. We're failing on all of those fronts. Women are too scared to approach the police to report rapes because of secondary trauma. They're often either turned away or they're asked what they did to actually bring about the abuse that they received. What were they wearing? Were they drunk? Did they know the perpetrator? So
from a Helen Suzman Foundation, from the research that you're doing and the awareness that you've got about the challenges, another act is not really going to sort out our problems.
Absolutely not. Not in my opinion, and I don't believe that even the president actually believes that from his own speech to the summit last year. Because he did recognize that we have progressive laws, and I don't think that can be denied.
And recently, after we saw the protest by women following Uyine Mkhwejana's death, killing, we heard him again in Parliament. He addressed the nation. There was a special session to say this is an emergency.
That's right. We are in a state of, well, not a state of emergency, it's called a national crisis. And as we've seen 2 days ago, protests emerged all over the world. where people were protesting against gender-based violence and femicide in their own countries. Latin America, Europe, we're not unique, but we have the highest rates.
So we're facing a global crisis. We're part of
Absolutely.
this huge global crisis against women. Now, very, very briefly, Leanne, before I let you go, we've got a number of developing stories that we're covering live, but it's very important. In your view, as a Helen Suzman Foundation, what would be the right things to focus on now?
We have to focus on what we already have. So we have to look at training and especially sensitization training for our criminal justice system, training our police, our prosecutors and our judiciary. That is actually what happens in special offences courts, sexual offences courts, which are specially made for sexual offences. They have very specialised training given to magistrates, prosecutors and court assistants. And that, I think, should be applied across the board. I don't understand why it should be restricted to those types of courts.
Now, beyond the legislative setup, you mentioned something earlier. You said we as a society are failing our women. What's the role then? What could we do? From a Helen Suzman Foundation, as an NGO, you're in touch with societal issues as well. What do you think can be done? I mean, I had somebody sitting on Monday where you seated a lady and who's a gender-based gender activist, and she was saying it starts in the home.
That's right. Absolutely. It's grassroots. We need to prevent gender-based violence going forward. We need to undo stereotypes. We need to undo toxic masculinity. And in order to do that, if we can't start in our homes, we should at least do it in our schools. There should be education programs targeted at boys and young men. And also, I think even in the summit, it was mentioned that there should be social behavior change programs that are rolled out in all communities. We need to undo our attitudes. We need to also, in the media, stop these type of stereotypes.
And that gender activist's name, I just remembered, it's Rosie Mutene. She said another issue we're facing is patriarchy.
Yes.
And if you look at cultural practices in our
Absolutely.
country, historically, patriarchally, we men sort of thrive under this kind of system that continues to assist us in a way, that's a wrong word, but because we're literally subjugating and violating our women.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And even President Ramaphosa said that last year in the summit. He said we have a culture of victim blaming, which actually is an expression of the patriarchy.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very clear that we need much deeper and wider interventions than just having an act.
Yeah.
While the intentions might be understandable, but we have legislation that exists already that we can try and tweak and strengthen to make it harsher. So there's both work to be done, lots of work to be done from a prevention perspective and a punishment perspective.
And harsher punishment as well for sexual offenders.
What would be a harsher punishment? Because there have been calls for a referendum for a death penalty. Our constitution doesn't provide for that. Yeah. Life sentence is the longest kind of punishment you can get. You can be jailed for.
So the problem with obviously the death penalty, that we won't ever get that back. The constitution doesn't allow for it. We have the right to life, and also S versus Makwanyana, the Constitutional Court confirmed death penalty will never be coming back. So that is not an option, and I don't necessarily disagree with actually it never coming back. But we have life sentences, and I understand the people's frustration because sometimes perpetrators get off on parole long before they've ever served nearly a long sentence.
So we need to implement what the President said. If you've murdered a woman, if you get jailed, you get a harsher sentence. If you've raped a woman, there should be no parole.
Absolutely. And also, victims are often not even notified of the fact that their perpetrators are applying for parole. We have the Bob Hewitt example. So that even if they do apply for parole, which they have the right to, it must always be opposed, and victims should always be notified, particularly sexual offences.
Thank you very much for your views and your insights there. Thanks for your time. Leanne Germanos from the Helen